The large auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center fell into complete silence. Every person in the room slowly turned toward Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who sat upright on the stage. Even though she was small in stature and her health had declined in recent years, her presence still controlled the entire hall. Her sharp, focused eyes were locked onto the podium where Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was standing. "Justice Ginsburg," Crockett began respectfully, her voice echoing through the hall, "with all respect for your remarkable legacy, your slow and careful approach to women's rights has failed countless women. While you chose to work patiently within the system, many women continued to suffer. And your widely praised friendship with Justice Scalia represents exactly what is wrong with our political culture today. Working closely with people who continuously attack women's rights is not justice, is surrender." The audience gasped. Shock flashed across students' faces while distinguished professors shifted uncomfortably. Many could not believe what they were hearing. A sitting member of Congress had just confronted the legendary RBG directly and openly. The 87-year-old justice did not respond immediately. Instead, she calmly removed her glasses and placed them gently on the table before her. Her expression remained composed. But those who knew her well noticed the slight tightening of her jaw, a rare sign that Justice Ginsburg was truly irritated. What happened next would leave the entire auditorium stunned and forever change how the nation viewed one of America's most iconic justices. But before we dive deeper into this dramatic confrontation, a moment now studied by legal scholars, political analysts, and historians, make sure to subscribe to the channel and enable the notification bell. This powerful exchange between two influential women reveals deeper truths about the fight for equality, the strategies behind justice reform, and the generational divide in activism. The Georgetown Law Symposium dedicated to women and the Constitution had been organized to honor Justice Ginsburg's extraordinary contributions. For more than 6 decades, from her early struggle against discrimination in law school to her groundbreaking work with the ACLU Women's Rights Project, to nearly 30 years on the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg shaped gender equality one case at a time. By the age of 87, she had become a cultural symbol. Her image appeared on posters, mugs, and shirts. Even her workout routine became famous. Her dissent collar turned into a nationwide emblem of resistance. Generations of young women admired her steady, strategic approach to changing the law, but not everyone agreed that her cautious style still worked in today's polarized political climate. Some activists criticized her decision not to retire during the Obama presidency, saying that choice opened the door for conservatives to replace her. Others questioned her friendship with Justice Anton Scalia, arguing that it softened the image of a man who opposed major civil rights protections. Ginsburg rarely defended herself publicly. She believed long-lasting change came from persuasion, not confrontation. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett followed a very different philosophy. At only 42, the Texas Democrat had quickly become one of the most outspoken progressive voices in Washington. As a former civil rights attorney who represented Black Lives Matter protesters, she was known for her boldness and direct challenges. Her fiery speeches often went viral, building her a massive online following. She believed in standing her ground, refusing compromise, and pushing aggressively for immediate change. The symposium had originally been imagined as a respectful discussion between 2 generations of feminist leadership: Ginsburg's slow, methodical legal strategy and Crockett's passionate, confrontational activism. Professor Elena Kagan, who taught at Georgetown before joining the Supreme Court, had asked that the conversation remain focused on ideas, not personal attacks. But the moment Crockett began her remarks, it became clear she was prepared to break those rules. This was no ordinary disagreement. It symbolized a national debate. Should progress come gradually through careful legal battles, or through bold demands that refuse to accept compromise? The clash raised questions about generational feminism, respect for past pioneers, and whether today's activists value the sacrifices of those who paved the way. For Ginsburg, her entire philosophy was being challenged. For Crockett, it was a chance to reject what she saw as outdated strategies that allowed injustice to continue. The crowded room of students, faculty, lawmakers, and journalists understood they were witnessing a historic, once-in-a-lifetime confrontation. What do you think? Does real progress come from slow, strategic action or from fearless, direct pressure? Share your perspective in the comments and let us know. Which approach has been most successful in advancing civil rights in American history? The Georgetown Auditorium, decorated with polished wood and portraits of legendary judges, had hosted many major debates before, but never one like this. Let me make this extremely clear, Crockett continued, sensing the tension in the room. Your belief in working with the other side has only allowed conservatives to grow stronger while stripping women's protections away piece by piece. Her voice sharpened as she lifted a sheet of paper. Your praised friendship with Justice Scalia helped legitimize views that caused real harm, she declared. Looking directly at Ginsburg, here is a list of his decisions against women's rights. LGBTQ protections and voting access, Crockett continued firmly, raising the papers in her hand. These are not vague legal theories or academic debates. Real people were hurt by these rulings. Yet you still called him a close friend and even went to the opera together. The audience shifted anxiously. The moderator, a Georgetown law professor who looked increasingly uncomfortable, leaned toward the microphone. Congresswoman, perhaps we could move to the legal arguments. This is the legal argument. Crockett cut in immediately. When we treat people who deny our humanity as if they are simply colleagues with different views, we normalize their oppression. Justice Ginsburg's slow, cautious strategy may have worked 50 years ago, but today our rights are disappearing much faster than they can be won. She turned her attention back to the justice. And let's be completely honest. Your decision not to retire during President Obama's term was a political risk that put everything you fought for in danger. You gambled with the rights of millions because you would not step aside. Several audience members winced. A respected female judge seated in the front row shook her head in disappointment. Still, Crockett didn't stop. And then there's Shelby County v. Holder, she said sharply. That ruling destroyed the Voting Rights Act and you wrote the opinion. A buzz swept through the crowd. Even those who supported Crockett's passion recognized her error. Justice Ginsburg had actually written a powerful dissent in that case. Not the majority opinion? You've got the wrong justice, Congresswoman. Someone called out from the audience. Crockett paused for only a breath before pressing on. My broader point remains the same. The court has been dismantling civil rights piece by piece, while polite collegiality has done nothing to stop that erosion. She fixed her stare directly on Ginsburg. You once said that women belong in every room where decisions are made. I agree. But when those decisions cause harm, polite behavior is no virtue, it becomes cooperation with injustice. Incremental change is a luxury that working women and women of color cannot afford. Tension filled the auditorium. Young law students who grew up idolizing RBG looked conflicted, torn between their admiration for her and their understanding of some of Crockett's frustrations. Older judges and attorneys, however, appeared shocked, seeing the Congresswoman's comments as an unacceptable attack on a beloved legal icon. Throughout all of this, Justice Ginsburg didn't move. Her expression remained composed, her posture steady. Years of dealing with discrimination and arguments she was never expected to win had taught her the power of stillness. She didn't interrupt. She didn't frown. She showed no anger at all. The moderator tried again. Perhaps we should open the floor to questions. I'm not finished, Crockett insisted strongly. Justice Ginsburg, your dissents may be beautifully written, but at the end of the day they are still dissents. They don't carry the force of law. They've been turned into slogans and printed on tote bags, but they do nothing to protect women's rights. We need justices who won't stay silent or polite while our freedoms are attacked. At last, Crockett stopped speaking. The moderator, visibly relieved, turned toward Ginsburg. Justice, would you care to respond to the Congresswoman's remarks? The room fell absolutely silent. Every eye focused on the elderly woman sitting with perfect posture at the center of the stage. Some expected her to decline politely, as she had often done in the past. Others thought she might give a short, neutral response meant to calm the crowd. Instead, Justice Ginsburg leaned in toward her microphone. Her voice, though soft, was steady and carried the faint touch of her Brooklyn upbringing. "I would be happy to respond to the Congresswoman," she said calmly. "Debate is essential to a healthy democracy." She placed her hands neatly on the table. Light glinted off her famous dissent collar and the ring she always wore. "What we have here is a meaningful difference in how each of us believes lasting progress is achieved within our constitutional system. This disagreement is not new. It has existed in every chapter of the struggle for equality." The audience leaned forward as if pulled by gravity. One of the most influential legal thinkers of the modern era was about to defend not just her decisions, but her entire approach to justice and reform. Justice Ginsburg lifted a glass of water and took a slow drink. The quiet moment only deepened the attention in the room. When she began speaking again, her tone remained measured but powerful, an authority she developed decades earlier arguing in front of male judges who often tried to silence her. "Congresswoman, Crockett believes my approach to advancing women's rights is too cautious, too patient, too willing to work with those who disagree," she said. "She interprets my friendship with Justice Scalia as a sign of compromise rather than strength, as if mutual respect could erase deep ideological differences." She reached to the side and picked up a thin folder that no one had noticed before. "If I may," she said, gently opening it, "I'd like to begin with a short history lesson." She paused, looking down at her handwritten notes. "When I first began challenging gender discrimination in the 1970s, Justice Ginsburg said softly, in the world I began practicing law in," Justice Ginsburg continued, her voice steady, "almost every rule was tilted against women." She let her words hang in the room. A woman could legally be fired simply for becoming pregnant. Banks were allowed to deny credit cards to women unless they had a husband to sign for them. Public universities could openly tell qualified women, "We don't admit your kind here," and in many states, the law didn't even recognize marital rape as a crime. She turned her eyes toward Crockett, her expression firm but calm. "I chose to challenge that system methodically, step by step, case by case, not because I lacked boldness, but because I understood how the law develops. Each legal win becomes the building block for the next. Without a solid foundation, progress collapses." Her voice grew stronger as she faced the Congresswoman directly. "You call these small steps? Let me remind you who those steps were taken for. Sally Reed, a grieving mother, denied the right to manage her own son's estate simply because she was a woman. Sharon Frontiero, an Air Force lieutenant, denied housing benefits that were automatically given to her male peers. Stephen Wiesenfeld, a widower, denied survivor benefits he needed to raise his newborn child. These were not theoretical debates," she added, turning a page in her folder. "These were real people suffering real harm." She paused briefly before continuing. "When I argued Sharon Frontiero's case at the Supreme Court, every justice on the bench was a man. I could have stood there and shouted that the system was patriarchal. Instead, I showed them how gender discrimination hurt their own wives and daughters. I made them see themselves in the case." A hint of emotion softened her voice. "That was not weakness. That was strategy. It was the only approach that could succeed at a time when the legal system was firmly against us." Around the auditorium, a few audience members nodded as her words sank in. Even some who had initially leaned toward Crockett's critique seemed to reconsider. "You also suggested my friendship with Justice Scalia was some kind of betrayal," Ginsburg said, shifting to another document. "Let me tell you what that friendship allowed us to accomplish." She held up a marked-up draft. "This is an early version of Justice Scalia's writing in United States v. Virginia, the case that finally opened the Virginia Military Institute to women. His draft contained language that would have drastically narrowed the ruling. Because he and I spoke honestly and respectfully, even when we fiercely disagreed, that limiting language was removed." She lifted her gaze. "He did not change his vote. He never changed his ideology. But through genuine dialogue, we protected women's rights for generations." Do you call that surrender, Congresswoman? I call it effective advocacy. At the podium, Crockett shifted her stance. Her earlier certainty unsettled by the precision of Ginsburg's response. As for my dissents, the justice continued, you dismiss them as symbolic, but that shows a misunderstanding of what dissents actually do. She raised a single finger. A dissent forces the majority to refine its reasoning. A second, it provides a roadmap for future lawyers. A third, and most importantly, it speaks to Americans who will come after us. She removed her glasses and looked at Crockett without a barrier between them. When I wrote in Shelby County that getting rid of preclearance was like throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a storm simply because you aren't getting wet, I wasn't writing for turts. I was laying down a principle that civil rights lawyers across the country rely on today in courtrooms fighting voter suppression. Several professors in the audience nodded. One whispered, we use that dissent in nearly every voting rights case. You also raised my choice not to retire during President Obama's term, Ginsburg continued, her tone even. I made that decision based on my health and my capacity to continue serving. No one has the ability to predict a future. Each of us makes decisions with the information we have at the time. I believed I could keep contributing. She tapped her papers into a neat pile and leaned slightly forward, a sharper intensity entering her voice. But we must avoid framing advocacy as a choice between being overly polite or constantly confrontational. That's a false distinction. Change has always come from a combination of strategies working in tandem. She held up one hand as she explained. While I was building precedents through the courts, others were marching in the streets. While I persuaded conservative judges with arguments they could accept, others pushed the limits and expanded the conversation. These approaches do not undermine each other, they reinforce each other. A young student in the front row scribbled furiously, sensing they were hearing an unusually candid explanation of Ginsburg's philosophy. You argue that my gradual approach was timid, Ginsburg concluded firmly. But in truth, it was intentional. It was a strategy grounded in an understanding of how law evolves. She closed her folder. The precedents I helped establish, the rulings that first recognized gender discrimination as unconstitutional, are the very pillars upon which today's advocates stand. She gently closed the folder, resting both hands on top of it with deliberate calm. A well-known quote often linked to Martin Luther King Jr. came to her mind. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. Then she added, what people forget is that the arc doesn't bend by itself. Progress only happens when people pull it in the right direction. Some work within the system to reshape it, while others create pressure from the outside to move change forward faster. At this moment, Ginsburg's voice shifted into a tone that felt almost like a professor guiding a determined but still learning student. You describe my approach as if it failed simply because the problems we face today have not disappeared, she said. That shows a misunderstanding of how real progress works. Social change never moves in a perfect straight line. It moves in wave steps forward, steps back. She raised her hand slightly toward the portraits of historic legal figures displayed around the auditorium. Thurgood Marshall's carefully crafted legal battles did not fail just because racism still exists. Susan B. Anthony's lifetime of activism was not wasted simply because women still experience inequality. The ongoing struggle does not erase earlier victories. It demonstrates how hard the work is and how many generations must stay committed to pushing it forward. Her expression softened, though her words remained sharp. You dismiss the merchandise with my image as empty symbolism, but those symbols have inspired countless young women to believe they can become lawyers, judges, and even Supreme Court justices. Representation matters. Inspiration matters. Symbols matter. She straightened her posture, her presence filling the room even more. And regarding your criticism of my majority opinions compared with my dissents, I invite you to study them closely. In United States v. Virginia, I wrote the majority opinion, stating that any gender-based classification must meet an exceedingly persuasive justification. That standard remains one of the strongest legal protections for women's Writes Dot with her hands calmly folded again. She continued in an even steadier voice. Congresswoman, I have dedicated my entire career to fighting for equality with careful strategy, with persistence, and with a realistic understanding of how institutions evolve. You may choose a different approach, and that is entirely your choice. But hear this clearly, movements succeed because they include many kinds of fighters. Do not confuse my deliberate style with weakness. Civility is not surrender. Strategic patience is not fear. Her voice softened, but every word carried weight. I respect your passion. I too become frustrated with how slowly justice moves. But true wisdom lies in understanding when to confront and when to persuade, when to demand and when to negotiate, when to speak with fire and when to speak in a tone your opponent will actually hear. A deep silence filled the room. Congresswoman Crockett froze at the podium, clearly shaken by the power and clarity of Ginsburg's response. It wasn't a dismissal, it was a full masterclass in legal strategy from one of the greatest judicial minds of her era. The audience remained stunned. Visibly aware they had just witnessed something remarkable, the moderator finally broke the silence. Thank you, Justice Ginsburg. Congresswoman, would you like to respond? Crockett glanced at her notes, then back at the justice who had answered her critique with calm precision. I appreciate Justice Ginsburg's perspective, she said softly. There is much here for all of us to think about. As she took her seat, the tension in the room shifted into a shared understanding. This was more than a simple disagreement. It was a rare, profound conversation about how change actually happens within a democracy, within hours. Clips of Ginsburg's response spread rapidly across social media. Tags like #strategic advocacy and #RBG Masterclass dominated trending sections. News outlets and legal commentators rushed to cover the exchange. One analyst described it as a rare insight into Ginsburg's philosophy on institutional change. The New York Times framed it as a generational debate about strategy in the pursuit of equality, highlighting the broader questions it raised about democratic progress. Cable networks devoted entire segments to dissecting her words. On CNN, a legal analyst noted, "What we saw wasn't Justice Ginsburg defending her past. It was her defending a vision of change built on persuasion and precedent, not only protest." On MSNBC, a panel of women's rights lawyers from different eras echoed the same idea. One former ACLU attorney who worked with Ginsburg in the 1970s summarized it perfectly. She never gave up on full equality. She simply understood that real change requires patience, precision, and persistence. She chose every step carefully because every step mattered. Across law schools around the country, professors quickly began folding the viral exchange into their courses. At Harvard Law School, students packed into an auditorium for an impromptu lecture about the craft of advocacy. At Howard University School of Law, a civil rights professor played the clip as a real-time example of contrasting styles for achieving institutional change, a moment that challenged Congresswoman Crockett's own approach, but the public reaction was far more layered. Crockett's social media pages flooded with thousands of comments, some harshly critical, others offering thoughtful counterarguments. She initially released a short statement saying she deeply respected Justice Ginsburg's historic contributions, but she also insisted that the current era might demand new methods and new urgency. 3 days later, she wrote a longer, more reflective piece in The Atlantic. My exchange with Justice Ginsburg pushed me to think more deeply about how different forms of advocacy support one another, she explained. I still believe strongly in bold, uncompromising voices calling for immediate action, but I now better understand how strategic legal foundations make those demands possible in the first place. The most impactful reactions didn't come from political figures, they came from young lawyers and activists who had long felt torn between Ginsburg's steady, incremental approach and Crockett's fiery, confrontational style. On blogs and social media threads, they debated whether progress is built through slow, deliberate institution building or through disruptive demands for immediate justice. One young public defender summarized the growing sentiment in a widely shared post. Maybe real change needs both. We need RBGs creating legal precedents, and we need activists pushing the country forward. These aren't competing visions, they are complementary strategies. 1 week after the symposium, Justice Ginsburg sat down with NPR's Nina Totenberg for an interview. When asked about the public back and forth, she answered with her usual calm. The Congresswoman raised important questions worth serious reflection. Each generation must discover its own way of fighting for equality. My generation laid groundwork, but the next generation decides how to build upon it. When Totenberg pressed her about whether the criticism bothered her, Ginsburg smiled gently. In my early career, I was told I didn't belong in law school because I was taking a man's place. I was denied clerkships despite graduating at the top of my class. And I was paid less than male colleagues doing the very same job. After those experiences, respectful criticism of my judicial philosophy is hardly something that troubles me. The ripple effects of the moment stretched far past the viral clip. Law schools began reporting a surge of interest in courses on civil rights litigation, advocacy strategy, and movement building. Georgetown Law even created a new annual lecture series titled Multiple Paths to Justice, inviting advocates from many backgrounds to explain how they pursue meaningful social change. 6 months later, Justice Ginsburg announced her retirement due to ongoing health challenges. In her official statement, she deliberately referenced the Georgetown Exchange. The conversation about how to advance equality must never stop. Each generation builds upon the efforts of those who came before, sometimes continuing their path, other times charting a new one. At her final public event before stepping down, she was asked what advice she would offer young activists frustrated with slow progress. Her answer seemed directed not only to them, but subtly toward Congresswoman Crockett as well. Fight for the things you care about, but do so in ways that bring others with you. Real change rarely comes instantly. Be strategic, be patient, and remember that sometimes the most transformative act is not breaking institutions apart, but reshaping them from within. 3 years later, Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated how deeply that message had stayed with her. When she introduced a bill to strengthen voting rights protections, she anchored her floor speech in Justice Ginsburg's famous dissent in Shelby County v. Holder, quoting the justice's warning against throwing away your umbrella in the middle of a rainstorm. When the bill passed with bipartisan support, Crockett publicly acknowledged that it rested on the legal framework created by Ginsburg and earlier civil rights leaders, proof that real progress is built on both vision and careful planning. The Georgetown Law Symposium became far more than a viral clash between two women with different philosophies. It evolved into a powerful case study of how social movements mature, how diverse strategies strengthen one another, and how dialogue across generations, even tense dialogue, can deepen the broader struggle for justice. As one constitutional scholar noted, the Ginsburg-Crockett exchange was never about proving one side right and the other wrong. It was about recognizing that the fight for equality requires both architects who build slowly and visionaries who demand immediate action. Their tension is not a flaw. It is the force that drives progress forward. Thank you for watching our full breakdown of this historic conversation between Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. If you found this analysis valuable, please like the video and subscribe for more in-depth political and legal insights. Share it with others who care about equality and tell us in the comments. Do you believe progress comes faster through patient strategy, bold confrontation, or through both working together? Your voice helps keep this essential conversation alive.